Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Sarah. I'm a community and content manager at Optimal Workshop. This is UX Insider, and we're about to be joined by Alexis. She'll be talking about accessible content design for outdoor exploration and dive into a case study about Washington State parks. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our amazing speaker, Alexis. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah. I am Alexis Church, and I'm here to talk to you about accessible content design and walk you through a case study of Washington State Parks and how they were able to apply accessible content design to their website to have some really great results that I'm going to talk about today. So again, my name is Alexis Church, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a senior content strategist at Anthrotech. Anthrotech is a human-centered design consultancy, and we work with clients on human-centered design projects, ranging from clients who work in government spaces at all levels of government to for-profit businesses with a social impact mission, as well as not-for-profit organizations. We have a little plan for our time here today. I would love to start by defining content design and accessibility, get some tips for accessible content design, see it in action with the Washington State Parks case study, and talk about how you can maintain accessibility at the end of the day after you've done all this hard content design work. So let's just jump in with some of the boring stuff to get out of the way. I want to make sure we're all on the same page about how we're defining content design. Different companies, organizations have different definitions for some of these terms. And so it's important that we make sure we're on the same page. Content design is really all about structuring content from my perspective. It considers user needs on the front end of a website. So you're seeing that here on the right. This is a Washington State Park page. And then it also considers the backend systems and how people will enter content. And that's on the left-hand side here. So a website backend. It's the work of finding patterns and building content types and components and structuring those kind of like Lego blocks to build a larger creation. There's a lot of ways to do content design. You could use the core model, object-oriented UX, but I'm not going to get a ton into those methods in this chat. That would be a different chat, and I'm glad to point you to some resources for that if you're interested. A lot of content design is not about creating copy or writing content. Sometimes in content design, we see if copy fits or content fits into the designs that we have, and we should be doing that. But it isn't really necessarily about the practice of writing content. I also want to start by defining accessibility. Web accessibility means that websites, tools, and technologies are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. And this is a definition from the Web Accessibility Initiative. And these are the folks who created the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Web accessibility can be used interchangeably with digital accessibility. It also applies to website applications, front-end systems, and back-end systems, especially if your team relies on back-end systems to do their jobs. It's an international standard that defines what's needed to be accessible. You're also going to hear me talk a little bit about assistive technology during this talk. People with disabilities access and navigate digital technologies in different ways depending on their individual needs and preferences. Assistive technology can help them do this. It can include software, hardware that people with disabilities can use to interact with the web. It can be something like a screen reader, screen magnification, speech recognition software, tabbing through a screen, and way more. When we talk about designing for accessibility, a key component of that is making sure our websites and digital tools interact well with people and their assistive technology. So because of this, it can be really easy to consider accessibility technical and think of it as the developer's work, but it's not. It sounds like it's development and coding, PDF remediation. It seems really technical, and sometimes we get accessibility experts involved. But supporting with accessibility work is an opportunity for UX practitioners, including content strategists and content designers, to get a seat at the table and collaborate with developers and other work streams to make a really big impact. And content has a huge role in that. So content can help accessibility with content design, with content governance, which are those editorial processes you maybe make, style guides and tools, training, and then into that actual content writing and content creation phase. Content touches so many aspects of digital products, from the foundations of that content design all the way to creating content. And we're going to talk about some tips for how we do that just in a second. So first, we want to start by understanding the current state of our content. We can use an inventory and an audit to understand more about our content. And this is an inventory from Washington State Parks. An inventory tells you the facts. So anything that I know about the content, you would know exactly the same way in an inventory. It's an HTML page or it's a PDF. It's very factual. An audit, however, answers questions about your content, like is it redundant, outdated, or trivial? And I might have a different opinion about that than Sarah does, or someone else on this call. So we can also ask some questions in our audit about whether or not our content is accessible. And some accessibility audit factors that you can use are images accessible? So do they have alt text? Do they have text in them? Is that text somewhere else on the page? We can also ask, is the heading structure correct? So is there one heading 1 on the page? And then after that, we use heading 2s, which are subheadings, and heading 3s, which are subheadings of those headings, heading 2s. We can also ask, are videos accessible? Are tables structured correctly? Is link text clear? Do we not say, read more, read more, read more over and over on the page? Or do we have better link text that's clearer about where people are going to land? So we don't have to wait until our website is audited for accessibility with an automated or manual accessibility check. When we do our content checkups, like our inventories and our audits, we can look for accessibility. We can find patterns when we do these inventories and audits so that we can share them with our team for improvements. So if you're redesigning an app or a website, you can use the findings from your accessibility audit or your general audit with accessibility factors, and you can help avoid common issues in the future. So if you learn from an audit of your content that 85% of your images don't have alt text, maybe you need to require alt text in your content management system or in your web application, or maybe you need to ask a developer to add a field to the back end of your website. And that's the content design piece of the work. So this inventory and audit is just setting us up to do that. It's giving us data that we can use. So another example, maybe you find 61% of pages have images without alt text. These types of findings help you understand what kind of accessibility errors are being made. They become an input to design a better system in the future, and they can help you get buy-in for content changes. So if you're able to tell a development team or a product team, we have this many pages or this many pieces of content without alt text, you're going to have a much easier time getting buy-in than if you say, I think we should add alt text to some of our images. These concrete data points can be really helpful for getting buy-in for your design. They also help you identify those patterns right there at the beginning. So again, gonna recap that. We can use our audit data to design content for accessibility. We can identify page types for structured content. We can find patterns in the content that can be used for design. We can understand where content editors might need some help to meet standards. If people aren't adding alt text, we need to help them figure out how to do that. We can also identify opportunities for upskilling and training. Perhaps we have fields for alt text, but people just don't know what they are or how to use them. And that's an opportunity for training and upskilling. So we take all these inputs And we can start to build accessibility into our content models. And our content models are kind of the back end structure of our website. So they describe the hierarchy of information for the designer on the front end, like this should come first, and then this, and then this. And then on the back end, they describe the field choice suggestions that you're making to the developer. So sometimes I would choose a taxonomy selection over open text because I know that different folks need that type of field. So I can give those suggestions to a developer, keeping in mind who's entering content into the system. We can also provide accessibility information like heading structure. You see that I'm doing that actually in here. It's a little small, but I have a column that says notes for dev, and I'm pointing out where heading structure needs to be a heading 1 versus a heading 2 versus a heading 3, which is going to help the developer code the website in an accessible way. We can also add content help text that will help content editors write content that is accessible, and we'll take a closer look at that. I do want to share that maybe you haven't built content models in an Excel spreadsheet like this. An alternative to documenting these types of accessibility guidelines to a spreadsheet that maybe is a little overwhelming, you can annotate your Figma or your other design system that you're using. I've been doing a lot more of this lately in collaboration with our UX UI designers. It's not always an option, but sometimes it's a better way to deliver this accessibility information. So always just check in with your developer before you get started. Would you prefer content models with the field choices, or would you prefer to have an annotated Figma? And you can make those decisions as a team as you're starting to build out your work. The next piece of this content design is like these individual field choices. When we're making choices as content designers about individual fields on the back end of a content management system or an application, the first thing we should ask ourselves is who's entering content. Sometimes this is a communicator or it's a web manager, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a subject matter expert like a park ranger, or perhaps someone who's a program manager or administrator at your company. So we want to make sure we're thinking of fields that those folks will be able to use. An example I gave a little earlier that I'd like to dive further into is taxonomy versus open text. So if you have someone who is less familiar with communications or content management systems or technology like this, a taxonomy where they can just check off what they want to tag a page with can be a lot easier than having to write out a summary or a whole bunch of text for those folks. You can give them an easy selection option, and then they don't have to do as much work trying to figure out how to communicate those things. So these are the types of field choices that we can start to make. We can also make field choices for accessibility, right? So we see in this example on the screen a field for alternative text, for adding alternative text for an image. Alternative text shows up if the image doesn't load, but it also is read out by screen readers. And this is a field that a content editor will need to fill in. So here we've added some content help text, short description of the image used by screen readers and displayed when the image is not loaded. This is important for accessibility. So this makes it so that the content editor knows what the importance and significance of alt text is and gets a little help filling that in. You might write slightly different content help text for a field like this, depending on who is entering the content into your backend system. We want to write that help text again with our audience in mind. So if we know our audience is more subject matter experts, we can avoid using jargon from content strategy or content design, and we can use more plain language. So you might need to explain what a screen reader is, or you might need to give a little more context than what we've given here. We can also choose fields that make it easy to be accessible. So In this example from WordPress, we have alternative text, title, caption, and description. And this is for an image upload. So a tip that I like to share is that we can require alt text, but make captions optional. When we require both alt text and captions for images, we often find that content contributors who are putting content into a management system will copy paste from the alt text to the caption. So either make it so one of those only is required. I recommend alt text, or you can write some content help text to remind people that alternative text tells you what's in the image, and a caption gives you extra context about the image. These are the types of decisions that you as a content designer can make so that it's easier for people to be accessible. I think a big part of our job as content designers is to create systems where it's easier to be accessible than it is to be inaccessible. Accessibility, when it's built in, can be smooth and just a part of a process. It doesn't have to be outside of a process or a remediation effort. With that in mind, I'd love to give you all a little checklist for accessibility. We want to choose content entry fields that support accessibility. So those choices around alt text versus captions that we just talked about, that's a great example of that. We also want to exclude styling or fields where content editors won't have enough training to be accessible. An example of this is accordions. Many people don't know how to use accordions, which are the little drop-down menus you have on web pages that hide content and then open up and you see a bunch of content. Many people don't know how to use those accessibly. So either train folks in how to use them accessibly or decide not to have them on your website so then people can't make that accessibility mistake. They can find another way to present that content. We can also write help text that gives content creators accessibility tips as they're entering content. We saw some examples of that already. We can check color contrast with our user interface designer. So color plays a big role in accessibility, and contrast is the background and foreground, how different those colors are. We want to make sure they meet a certain ratio, and you can work with your user interface designer to check those things. We can make sure as content strategists, we're not using color alone to indicate meaning. We can also make sure our font sizes are large enough to read. And we can ask an accessibility expert to review our work and choose a developer that incorporates the web content accessibility guidelines. So making sure that we're collaborating with developers that know those guidelines, or if they don't, we can share those guidelines with developers so that they can get an overview of them. All right, that was a lot of information about how you can incorporate content design, accessibility into your content design. And now I'd like to do a brief case study of how Washington State Parks was able to do that with their website. So Washington State Parks, this was their old website on the right. They had seen a large increase in visitors to their parks during the pandemic. They saw a ton of pain points on the website that were starting to come out as a result of that increase in visitors to their website. There were multiple layers of navigation on their site. People were having trouble finding information. The park pages were set up where you could search for your park in an alphabetical list, or you could search for it by region. There wasn't really a park search to begin with. There was a lack of accessibility. Images didn't have alt text in some cases, and there were opportunities for improvement in other cases. They really wanted to live this value that they had, that the parks are for everyone. And so this website redesign was an opportunity to do that. And the way that we did that is we started with a content audit. We found that unstructured content made it really hard for people to find information, including accessible park features. Readers had to dig through narrative structures like the one on this example page, where they just had paragraphs of information so that they could find safety information like burn bans or accessible features like, are there boardwalks where my wheelchair can go? Are there access points for my wheelchair, or can my grandma take her walker? Those kinds of questions, you had to dig through this information to find. Pages lacked a heading structure that serves as wayfinding for users. And we also learned that 87% of tables lacked accessible structure. The tables on the site were being used for formatting or were missing key information that helps assistive technology like screen readers navigate them correctly. 61% of images had text, and the images that had text sometimes weren't working very well, and that text wasn't somewhere else on the page. This was like a ton of great information to have starting out designing a new website, right? We used those content accessibility factors that we talked about earlier, and we were able to get all this great information to start building out our new site. We took these inputs, the audit findings, as well as the inventory findings, and we started to use them to make a site structure and a taxonomy. And for the taxonomy, we knew we wanted people to be able to see accessible features of the park. So accessible campsites, ADA buildings, accessible restrooms, but we weren't really sure if people would want that lumped together with the basic amenities or out in their own category of accessible features. So we used Optimal Workshop to do that card sort, and we found that people preferred that those be looped in with the basic amenities for the most part. We also were able to set up a basic site structure and test that with a tree test using Optimal Workshop tools. And a researcher did a lot of that work, so I'm not going to get a ton into that work, but I think it's a really cool way that we were able to incorporate accessibility even into the structuring of our content. We also, after that, started to use audit findings to identify page types and build them out. So on the left is a rough sketch I made in a working session with our UX UI designer, so user experience and user interface designer. Next, she took that into kind of a good wireframe, and she made that a lot better. She added this really great gallery at the top and added heading styling that matched accessible headings. And then I gave her some content with accessibility guidelines like the heading structures, and she incorporated that into a final wireframe that had some color images in it. We repeated this process for all page types, considering accessibility as we went along. So we thought about color contrast, we thought about heading structure, we thought about what images we were adding and how they would need alt text. We thought about icons. So she introduced this really cool icon set, but those also were going to need alt text and labels that we worked on. Our accessibility director reviewed all this work that we did, which was really cool. She happened to be the project lead on this project, so she was around for each of these steps and gave us really good input along the way. If you don't have access, though, to an accessibility expert, like an accessibility director or specialist, you can still learn these basics and get free online tools to check things like color contrast and heading structure or font size. So these are things you can still incorporate even if you don't necessarily have access to an expert like that. Once we settled on the front end design, we started working through how we would map this to the back end and considered how people would enter content in an easy way, in a seamless way. So this is a Drupal backend. So the backend of a content management system showing how the backend fields line up to the front end. So the top box, you can't see it very well, but it says city and zip code, and that links up to the front end where it gives the city and the zip code of the park. This is future proofing. There's not a location search on the park's website right now, but we knew we wanted that information to be available for when they could add that location-based search. We also have our featured images. So on the back end, you upload those images, you add the alt text, which is required, and then those show up on the front end as accessible images. Then down under those images, we have the park overview, which lines up to the summary for the page on the front end. And so a developer built all of this backend based off of the content models I made with suggestions for the field types. And I'm going to show you those content models one more time just to refresh your memory. So they used field types that I suggested with field names, and made this content backend in Drupal. Of course, there were negotiations there. They had ideas for how something might work differently than I did. And we had meetings where we were able to talk that through and meet in the middle and make sure that we were building in these guardrails for accessibility. On this project, we actually worked with WaTech, who is a Washington State government Drupal developer, as well as they do other tech, but we work with them primarily on Drupal development. So it was really cool to see them implement these content models to build out the Drupal backend that you see right here. All right. So once we finish all of this, we can write content with accessibility in mind. So we needed to fill in some content before we were able to finalize the website and finish all of our research. And our redesign provided an opportunity to rewrite the content. A web manager over at Washington State Parks and I collaborated on this work after we had made it easier to be accessible in the content management system with content design. So you can build in these practices outside of a website redesign. We happen to have this website redesign as a kind of a project to work on this with. So we started to write content with accessibility in mind through this project. And Heather, the content manager over at Washington State Parks, she and I built accessibility into content governance. So this is a workflow that Washington State Parks has, and it's an editorial workflow for quick changes that need to be made to the website. And in this workflow, in the guides and tools, there are accessibility guides and accessibility tools like an accessibility checklist or a style guide, which includes accessibility guidance built right in. There's this whole review step that requires someone to check for accessibility. It's not explicitly stated here, but it's a part of the publisher's role to check for accessibility and send things back to folks who are writing content if it's not accessible. So our governance is the processes, tools, and training we use to keep our content in order. And Washington State Parks built out new editorial workflows for their website and incorporated accessibility into the review process. This is really, I think, like a key part of maintaining accessibility that we'll talk about in just a second. I also just saw a chat come in. I'm so sorry. Drupal is a content management system. It's kind of like WordPress or other types of content management systems that you might use. Craft is one that comes to mind, Civic Plus. There are tons of different content management systems. Drupal is one to check out. I think it's a really great system. Thanks for that question. So back to governance, we can also build governance. We can also build accessibility guidelines into style guides, which are a part of governance. So in this particular example, we have incorporated accessibility into the editorial style guide. So the guide gives guidance on how to write alt text versus captions, which are a little different. Throughout this guide, we also explained how to write link text that's descriptive enough that people understand where they're going to land. We gave guidance on how to format tables accessibly, and we reminded people not to put text in images. We used heading structure and order and showed people how to do that because that's really important for assistive technology who that might be reading a page out loud. And we also got an accessibility specialist, our director, to review this style guide and make sure that it worked really well for people. Again, you can put these types of guidance in without necessarily needing an accessibility specialist, and it starts to bake accessibility into the process without creating like remediation efforts that happen at the end of doing all this work. So bake it in from the start. We also, for Washington State Parks, built our accessibility guidelines into our content editor training. We did a lot of training for content editors as a result of this new website. So we built accessibility into those trainings. When the Washington developer, WaTech, built out the content management system training, they invited me and I was able to give tips on accessibility as we went through how to use the content management system. We did training in content writing and plain language writing, and we reinforced all of this training with guides and tools, as well as one-on-one editing sessions or communities of practice where people could ask questions about accessibility, or we could share out. We noticed folks are struggling with heading structure. Here's a reminder on how to do that correctly. So this was a really great opportunity as well for this project to build accessibility into our processes. Finally, for Washington State Parks, we had the opportunity to do accessibility reviews and usability testing throughout. We included participants with disabilities in the prototype usability test to test the website early with users. We also included people with disabilities in the pre-launch usability testing. So this was a really cool practice, and I recommend any UX researchers on the call that you consider doing this as well. We also did like throughout the website redesign, we did some informal reviews that our accessibility director did of the designs, guides and tools, and other deliverables. And then our development partner, WaTech, was really well-versed in accessibility, and they were receptive to input about accessibility changes. And this is where I think choosing a development partner wisely and making sure that they're comfortable or open to accessibility feedback is a great practice. So we baked accessibility into the process and we got really great feedback. We heard from one usability study participant, I like how they describe the pictures. They describe them very detailed. For someone who doesn't see, the more, the better. So this is the result of having a field for alt text in all of the images, as well as training people on how to use that alt text field, and then us actually going through and writing alt text for the multiple pictures on hundreds of parks pages. This was not a small effort, but it was really worthwhile because it made the site work for more people, which was really cool. So overall, the impact of this project was that we made images and pages way more accessible. We provided details for safe and informed visits to the parks. We made it easier to find information for people to visit the parks, including physical accessibility features like accessible campsites or ramps for visiting parks. The website also won 16 awards, including a Global Accessibility Awareness Day Foundation Award for accessibility. This is like one of the main accessibility guidance groups. And so this was a huge deal, and we were so proud to have won this award. It's the only website I have won this award for, so it was really cool to have gotten that feedback. So before we wrap up, I'm getting there, but I want to talk about how do we maintain all of this work? So we've put in the effort of looking at our content, finding patterns for accessibility, updating the design to kind of consider those patterns. Now, how do we maintain that? Because accessibility has to be a part of your processes for it to be maintained. Digital products are only accessible if the people maintaining them have knowledge about accessibility. So designing an accessible system at the beginning is a really good start. But once you start letting people into the system, if they don't have the skills they need, it won't be accessible. And this is where content design comes into play again. Content strategists are really great at maintaining content. We have tools and systems for it, and we can help help others do this with content governance, like we talked about in the Washington State Parks case study. You also can help teams understand why accessibility is important. Accessibility can seem really abstract and technical, and it can be overwhelming to hear something isn't accessible and you have a lot of remediation work to do. But if everyone participates, from the developer to the designers to the researchers to the content strategists, we can make more accessible systems and build it directly into our workflow. And when it's built into our workflow, it's less work. It becomes second nature and just a part of our processes. When everyone understands their part in those processes too, it's easier to get buy-in, and user research can help with that buy-in. So the usability study feedback that we got was particularly impactful for getting buy-in. We can also explain how accessibility impacts people and what is in each role's control. And we can use our content governance to communicate this. If you have access to change management, this is a great place to pull in change management as well to get help to share these types of things with your teams. So I'd love to share a couple resources here. The first link is a link to the web accessibility guidelines and some ideas about how designers and developers, as well as content folks, can help with accessibility. The next is a book that is about demystifying disability. This is a really great book on the basics of disabilities and how to talk about them and the history of disability. It's very much from a US perspective, but it's still a really great read, really helpful, and you can read it in a couple hours usually. Then there's a really cool YouTube video that shows how screen readers read emojis from Molly Burke, who is an influencer, and she has a ton of cool videos on YouTube, but this is one of my favorite. And then you can also join or start accessibility work groups or communities of practice at your organization so that you can have a group of people to talk about these things with and work on them with. So that's what I have so far. I'd love to answer any questions that you all might have.
Thank you so much, Alexis. It was a beautiful balance of talking about front end and back end, and being able to kind of explain some of those systems and tips and tricks. So thank you so much. As people are kind of thinking about their questions, I encourage you to type them into the chat. I will share one additional resource along with all the resources that Alexis shared will be in the email tomorrow. But here is a link to a talk we did last year, kind of showing a screen reader and accessibility and the perspective of a blind man, which was quite interesting. So I encourage everyone to watch that. I did have a question a bit about change management systems that you kind of mentioned at the end. What did that look like in the kind of Washington State Park Department, or how did you kind of utilize that resource to help the project?
Yeah, so I did some of the change management work on this project, which is rare. Sometimes we have other change managers on our team who do that. What was really unique about this project was the web manager at Washington State Parks, who I mentioned. She had just wonderful relationships with the park rangers throughout the park. So we were starting ahead of the game because she had built these really great relationships with folks throughout the agency. And we were able to share information with park rangers, executive leadership, and keep them updated about the project along the way. We had a lot of great share outs or all staffs where we shared where we were in the project and shared information about the usability studies that we did, as well as the progress we were making and how we needed people to be involved and help. So we checked in with people at least once a quarter to make sure that they knew what we were up to. And then we used that's not the word I'm looking for. We leveraged, I guess, those relationships with the park rangers that their content manager had to really share out some of the information and get help building out those park pages. Additionally, we held some like office hours where we all got together, got some snacks, came in person and wrote some content together. And those really helped us kind of build rapport and get to meet folks who were working on content that we might have not seen otherwise in our day-to-day work. And those were really helpful. The parks team suggested those, and we really enjoyed that. So change management pieces are often about making sure we're communicating the change that's happening and making sure that we're bringing people along with that change and building like coalitions throughout the organization who are excited for the change.
No, it sounds like you had a beautiful relationship with your clients and everyone that was involved in the process, and truly built transparency and trust within the system, which I think is just a great way to do it. And kudos to you. And obviously, it's a testament to all the awards you received, which is great.
Yeah, we had a great team on this project. It was really fun. I
Um,
see. Oh,
Go ahead.
I
Nope.
would, I think we were going to the same place. I see a question about accessibility expert resources that can help interpret instances or questions. You can definitely check out those WCAG guidelines, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Those are a great starting point. If you need any extra help, Anthrotech does have a bunch of accessibility specialists on staff that are really great with those types of questions. So those are two options. You can also reach out to a community of practice and see if you can ask a question in an accessibility group, either on LinkedIn or that you find online. There often are folks who are really willing to answer those quick one-off questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'll be sure to include those resources again in the follow-up email. Is there anything else that you would like to share or highlight?
I think that the last thing I would just say is that I think a lot of times content design in general, we think about the front end, and this is an opportunity and a call to action if you're a designer or content designer on this call, to also think about the back end and think about how people are putting that content in and where we can make it more seamless and easy for them to put that content into the content management system. We don't want to, of course, build front end experiences for those people. We want to build those experiences for our users, but we can still make it easier for them and enable the people inputting the content to do the right thing, be accessible, and use their content management systems well, or their web applications as well.
Yeah, and I think the fact that you were able to provide training and set up those guardrails that you mentioned, I'm sure it's just going to allow that website to have true longevity, which is what everyone wants, and to experience those parks. So thank you so much. I think the lack of questions is a true testament to the fact that you've done such a comprehensive and wonderful presentation. So thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Thank you, everyone. If you have any questions come up in the meantime, you're welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I would be glad to answer them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye bye now.